At least those kids finally shut up. I live right off the playground of my building, and like usually you only hear them. Oh, we're on. We're so professional tonight. Sorry guys about that, but hey, what's up? It's been a while, and we're back with the movie discussion, Pocket Dimension, where time does not exist and the only thing that matters is film. Hopefully somebody's watching, because we've missed our last couple weeks, and then we did almost pretty much no advertising, as you say, for this episode, because we just didn't have it together this week, and we apologize for that. It was kind of touch and go if we were going to get this one done. But hopefully this will get us back on track as we try to finally wrap up our, it went a little longer because of where we missed weeks here and there, our series on New Hollywood. This is going to be the second last one. Then we have a really good last one, and actually planned one for hopefully next week, so we can finish off New Hollywood and move on to other things. But for this week, it's we want somebody else who's a fairly well-known director of the period. We've already done a few of them, and we'd be remiss probably not to mention a filmmaker like William Friedkin, who rose to prominence and fame in this era, doing some of the more important films of this era. We talked a lot about the year 1971, what a big deal that was, and one of the films we mentioned was his The French Connection. Mm-hmm. But going over that again would be, too close. We've already done sort of crime drama, stuff like that. But I mean, a very good film, Gene Hackman, blah, blah, blah. And then a few years later, the big hit, The Exorcist, which amazing film and very relevant and important, because it was really the first film that elevated horror from, this sort of cheesy B genre into something that could be considered, a more high art, taken more seriously, have serious drama in it, have good acting, all that kind of stuff. So, a landmark film that people talk endlessly about. And obviously, on our other show, The Sausage Factory, we've talked about it from time to time, as horror's our main focus there often. And it's widely considered one of the greatest horror films of all time. Some people say the best. Anyway, so those were two, really not just great quality films, but really big hits too. So they really raised his profile. And one of the issues we wanted to talk about, and this is how we decided on this film, and one of the reasons why we were we were a little late in coming up with it and stuff, was we were going back and forth about sort of how we wanted, what we wanted to do this show on, because we had our finale planned out, but we wanted something to sort of lead logically into that. And what we want to say is we didn't just want to cut New Hollywood off. We wanted to sort of show its progression and some of its decline. So this is some of the decline. Now, when we use those words, they're not absolutes. It's not exactly like, New Hollywood went like this or anything like that. But as we've stated before, whenever you're talking about an era, whenever you're talking about a period or something like that, regardless of what you're applying it to, there's no hard start. There's no hard end. Things don't just start. Things don't just cut off and end. And there's plenty of films made since what we might consider the official end of New Hollywood, maybe 80, 81, that still would have many of those elements, because that's the whole point. When these eras end, they don't exactly end; they just bleed into the future. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the progression we have, because how could we get here if we disregarded all the stuff from before? So we were talking about all the new stuff in New Hollywood. Well, all the new stuff it brought was great, but I mean, it's not like it still didn't lean heavily on some of the older stuff from previous eras. And that would be the same thing following this, where you'll see plenty of New Hollywood influence and style in movies that aren't necessarily considered part of the movement, ones that came afterwards. And anyway, to set up for that, we wanted to talk about some of the cracks where we're starting to see how things would change, because again, among the many changes that really shook up the world with New Hollywood was, as we said, this being the auteur period, directors having an unprecedented amount of control over their films. We were past, finally, the days of the big studios sort of ruling everything with an iron fist, the studio system, as it's called, where directors were really bound by that. And even though directors, all the way up to this, I'll stop saying, I promise, a little out of practice, but all the way up to this, directors could get a certain amount of acclaim. Certainly you could find a director even as early as the 20s who was a name. People would say, oh, that's his film, I'll go see him. But still, it was overshadowed by the production company itself, by the studio, sorry, or even the actors and stuff like that. finally, with the new Hollywood, we see directors really coming into their own and people getting excited, saying, "Oh, I'm going to go see this William Friedkin film or this Francis Ford Coppola film and stuff," more so than any time before that. And again, what came with that was a lot of freedom. Directors were finally able to take a lot of chances and risks that their predecessors weren't allowed to, and we've seen, and there were a lot of great results from that. But there's also a downside to it too. Sometimes some of the stuff can backfire horribly even, and eventually what would happen is we would have enough sort of failures or disappointments to the point where the powers that be would sort of reel the directors back in again and put them back sort of on a leash, and realize that they couldn't just give carte blanche to these creators, even if they were really talented or had produced hits. Because again, here we are in the case of somebody like Friedkin, who had already delivered 2 really great hit films, and this by no means sunk his career or anything, but it did help precipitate the decline and eventual sort of collapse of this era. And 1977 is the year it came out, and then there was another one what we were considering doing for this show that I'd watched also in anticipation, and that was New York, New York. That's Coppola, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not Coppola. No, that's
Scorsese.
Scorsese, yeah. And that's a good example of one too, because Scorsese had also been one of the architects of the movement, and it was basically him trying to go against what had made him successful and popular in the first place that kind of led to New York, New York not doing so well. He'd done some fairly gritty, on the streets, realistic films, and that was what he was really getting known for, you know, right off the bat with Mean Streets. And then the film he'd done just before that was a huge hit and is considered an absolute classic today, Taxi Driver. So basically flipping off of the success of Taxi Driver, he felt emboldened to do sort of, maybe I'm using this word too flippantly and I don't want it to be insulting, but I think it's kind of a vanity project on his part that he wanted to do New York, New York, because he wanted to do something that would be completely off the board and different from what he'd done before. He wanted to, it wasn't a traditional musical, but it was still considered sort of a musical because of its content. But he wanted to have sort of a, not fantasy, but again, a more old school atmosphere compared to what he'd done. Something that was actually more of a callback to the films of yesteryear that New Hollywood had so effectively broken away from. We talked about how some of those films had sort of an air of artificiality to them, an air of bombacity, spectacle, all those things, and how a lot of the New Hollywood films broke away from that by giving us much more realistic stuff, much more down-to-earth stuff, documentary style things and things like that. Whereas we see he wanted to do kind of the opposite of that and go back to the old style and show that he could do that in a film like New York, New York. And it's also very clear for anybody that's followed his career that he has a massive hard-on for the city of New York and just loves to celebrate it and focus on it. And one of the things about New York, New York in particular is that it's probably his favorite part is it was the New York of his own youth that he could go back and he loves to romanticize and remember it. And so he took his very successful actor off that movie, De Niro, and stuck him in there. And it seemed like a recipe for a great movie, and it didn't work out that well. And it's not quite the same thing here with Friedkin, but it's still going to have a similar effect. They both came out in 1977. They both kind of went against what the filmmaker had been known for in the past. And they both also had unfortunate timing that they were both released at the same time as the juggernaut that was Star Wars, which just took everybody by surprise, right? Star Wars was one of those things that no one could possibly anticipate. Star Wars is the ultimate story of like a movie coming out of nowhere and becoming a phenomenon. And it just dominated the summer of '77, crushing most of the other movies there. And New York, New York, and Sorcerer would be among them. So
it's like you were saying, when a director gets a certain level of success, they want to go do a big budget musical. Like we were talking about.
And then Coppola himself, would go on in the early '80s and do one from the Heart, which was even more of a spectacular failure. Like that's always remembered as just bombing hard and everybody hating it.
How hard did New York, New York bomb? What was the budget on there? Do you remember?
It was only like half or something. I think it made only like half. Like it wasn't the level of the other. The other I don't even think made $1 million or something.
Yeah,
it was like pathetic. And not that it's a topic, but having watched it recently, New York, New York is a fine film in many ways, but also I understand its problems and where it's flat. The main thing is that it's just so damn predictable and formulaic that every scene you can just basically predict. And what's funny, a little aside here too, is another, it's always considered not much of a movie for De Niro, who's had such a great career and stuff. And De Niro is often cited for some of his really great performances. And the two that come up the most, I think, that I hear are Taxi Driver, and the other one being from a few years later, Raging Bull. Now, for years, I purposely didn't watch Raging Bull because when people described it to me, they made it sound like something I'd have no interest in, because part of the whole character of Raging Bull is like he's kind of his own worst enemy. He's a bit self-destructive, blah, blah, blah. So what I heard from that was, oh, he's just going to be kind of like an unlikable asshole, and everything's his fault, and it's just everything. And I just thought it will be just some character that I can't root for or feel any sympathy for and stuff. Then when I finally saw it, I found he's actually quite the sympathetic character, at least in my view, he was. And I didn't just feel like he was a dumb asshole. Like, I felt empathy for him. I felt like he's not necessarily a bad guy. Whereas De Niro's character in this is just basically an unrepentant asshole that you feel no sympathy for. And through the whole movie, you just feel like Liza Minnelli's really stupid. Because it's all right there in front of her, going right down to the scene where they actually get married. Like, he's like yelling his head off and acting like a jerk, and he just acts like a jerk through the whole movie. And so that's another thing that really takes you out of it. Is like there's really nothing to take away from this character. He's just a jerk the whole way through, and it's not like he's just a jerk when he focuses on his career. He's just always a jerk. And so that's another thing I think that made the movie unlikable to me and probably helped make it achieve the result that it did. It's still a well-made movie. It has a really good look. They do a good job of creating New York at that time period, the late 40s, and then I think into the early 50s. It starts on V-Day, and it has some really spectacular scenes and stuff, and they're all very well done. But at the end of the day, it's just sort of an uninspired, uninteresting story that you can see, you can see everything coming a mile off. And the music is fairly authentic if you're interested in that kind of thing, like the big band era is what it's about. And of course, it did give us the song New York, New York. But what's funny is New York, New York, I think most people don't even remember it from that movie. They remember that 3 years after the movie, what's his name? Old Blue Eyes, Frank Sinatra added it to his set list. And Frank Sinatra is really the one that took the song and made his own. Nobody really remembers it for Liza Minnelli, even though for her whole career, when she did concerts, she always sang the song. I think it was basically eclipsed by Frank Sinatra's version. Just
sure.
So the one interesting thing I'll give in that too, though, is there is a little earlier part in the movie where you see some of the genesis, not in real life, but of how De Niro's character wrote the song. You get to see sort of how it evolves over time, how it starts out, and that stuff like that always really interests me. And there's just a little bit of it, but still. So anyway, New York, New York, and Sorcerer both again had some bad timing and issues, and we'll get into it. And helped bring on a slowing down and an eventual halt of the New Hollywood movement as the studios would reassert their control. In the meantime, there's still all sorts of really interesting and experimental things going on. Actually, one of the things that inspired Friedkin to make this film, much of it being shot in Central America, which is where a lot of it is set, is that he was inspired by the fact that initially George Lucas, and then it switched to Coppola, had gone down to the Philippines to shoot for what would become Apocalypse Now. He sort of felt like he needed to answer that somehow. So Sorcerer, deciding to do that is partly inspired by that. So what we got here is it's never been officially considered a remake, although a lot of people say it's basically a remake. There was a 1953 film, a European film called The Wages of Fear, based on a novel of the same name. A French novel, so that'd be La Salaire de la Peur, but with basically the same plot anyway. The 53 movie is quite well remembered, even though I honestly hadn't heard of it. But I looked it up, and it's and a lot of there's a lot of acclaim and stuff going on here. And whether or not you want to say this is an adaptation or a remake, in any case, this movie is not very well remembered. And we noted some of the reasons why. But anyway, so it's kind of an international film, which I like, but maybe that's another thing that helped lose audiences, in that you've got basically 4 main characters. One of them's American, but the others are from different places. You have a Mexican and then 2 different Europeans, I think. And
real quick, I have some questions straight out of the gate. Well, first of all, I'm showing some conflicting numbers here on the budgets. I've got one number of 12 and one number of 21 million, and Box Office Mojo says 21 with a let's see, I had it pulled up. It made like relatively made the majority of its money back over. I think it had 8 million in rentals, and then maybe like 12 in ticket sales worldwide.
Okay.
So
what I had was something
huge.
Yeah. What I had was something around 20 million, and then maybe a profit of 9 million. But that didn't take into account later on and stuff. So yeah, it's not basically a huge flop. It was more that initially, I guess the budget was supposed to be a lot smaller, and that's
a relatively small budget, though. I mean, comparatively.
I suppose, but still 1977, so 20 million.
Sure.
But I mean, they were thinking that it would be something for easily under 10 million, and then it sort of ballooned past that. And Friedkin didn't even have all of his main focus on it, which I think is another thing. I think he sort of saw it as it's been said that he sort of saw it as something to do as sort of an in-between project as he moved on to something else, because he was originally going to do a film called The Devil's Triangle, which wound up being canceled, and that was supposed to be a really big deal. It was supposed to be, I think that was going to be I don't know if it was going to be a sequel, but it was supposed to be like tied into The Exorcist in some way.
So he basically did this in between The Exorcist and The Brink's Job, which I'm not familiar with. And then
Yes.
Cruising was in 1980.
Yes.
And, Cruising, again, going back to his roots with that gritty, life on the streets type, crime drama, which I think he really manages to capture that look and feel in this movie as well.
Yeah, there is some good cinematography to that effect, I guess, and sort of atmosphere. Probably the weird thing about the movie is the soundtrack, right? What an odd movie to be one of the first movies. I have to think one of the first movies to use an electronic-based soundtrack. Like, this is Tangerine Dream that would go on to do all sorts of electronica-based soundtracks in the 80s. Got their start here in this movie, and it's
I was going to bring that up. Yeah,
it's kind of odd. I don't know if it's bad. I haven't really made up my mind if it's bad. I guess it doesn't take you out of it or anything like that.
I don't dislike the music, but it seems not very appropriate.
It doesn't seem appropriate, especially considering this is a film where the music there actually isn't very much, so you really notice it when it happens, because you'll have scene after scene without any soundtrack. Then suddenly the soundtrack will kick in, and you'll be like, "Oh yeah, right." And it seems pretty weird to me. But it's an odd title. One of the trucks has the name Sorcerer, which is where it comes from. One of the other trucks is something like Lazarus or something like that. And apparently that came from when he was down shooting. He noted that was something that was common amongst trucks in that part of the world, is that they would often be given names and put on them like they were ships or something. And maybe he thought that was interesting. And I think he would say something to the effect Sorcerer sort of fits in with the idea of how there's nothing supernatural in this movie, but I guess the main theme of the movie is sort of fate, and how fate can just screw us all over, and how we're kind of powerless before it.
Okay. Yeah, basically. I was going to ask you what you thought the title was. Aside from the name of the truck.
Yeah, that's why he was trying to decide between that or Lazarus or something like that, and I think he thought Sorcerer. Well, that sort of at least ties into it's the idea. It's there's no actual sorcerer in here, but in this, fate is the sorcerer. It's got the powers. It's controlling things. It's a bit of a reach, but
it's false advertising.
I know, and I think that's another. And I honestly think that's another thing that probably hurt it. When you give a title of a movie and it doesn't really tell you what it's about, that hurts it.
Yeah, I bet there was a lot of really disappointed D&D nerds.
I mean,
that flocked to see this movie.
Yeah, that would have been the first generation of D&D nerds. Most hardcore of all, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly.
but Yeah, I mean, you look at the poster and it's just like shows like some like truck barreling down the bridge and it says Sorcerer. That's just sort of confusing image, honestly.
It is. Yeah, totally.
So to get to the setup, it follows four guys that are basically on the run as criminals for vastly different reasons. Each guy is a different sort of criminal, and they're from different parts of the world. And so the big coincidence is they all wind up in this, remote village in Central America around the same time to take on a very dangerous job. They're lying low there, and then there's a factory several hundred miles away that goes up, and it's one of those fires that, because of it gets chemicals involved, is just burning out of control. There's nothing that can stop it, and to counteract that, they need to use dynamite, nitroglycerin, and the I don't understand the physics of that very well. It's not my area, but I'll take their word for it if they say that's what they need to do. Just like how they explain how they can't get and the only dynamite they have, this being sort of a third world country, the only dynamite they have this is true. I know this much. It's been sitting for too long. That means it sweats, and when it sweats nitroglycerin, that does make it very sensitive to movement. A bit of a bump and boom, it'll go up. That is true. I know that much. I'm not saying the other stuff isn't true. I'm just saying at least I knew about that. And then there's even an explanation when they're saying like it doesn't matter how you balance it, we can't take it in a chopper because there'll be too much turbulence. I'm thinking more turbulence than in a truck, but that's what they wind up saying they have to do. They have to drive these big unwieldy trucks. Trucks they have to basically build from scratch. They don't even have new trucks. They basically cull the parts from this truck graveyard to make, two workable trucks.
Yeah, it's from the get-go, it's not a very good idea.
No.
And something that crossed my mind, if dynamite is like this, why are we not just throwing sticks of dynamite? Why are we having to light fuses? Let's just throw the stick and it'll blow up on its own.
Because it has to age for a while. It has to sit around. It has to sit around. It has to stay in the same place. Like they say something about turning it. You have to, if you're going to store dynamite, you have to like move it every once in a while. You can't just let it sit stagnant for too long. And
okay.
If it does that's when it.
I get the concept. I just don't know.
Oh yeah. Like I said, I still have a hard time thinking that like they thought it was more feasible to do trucks than a chopper, but they have to make the movie work somehow. Not to mention the original plot is from the 50s, so it's more believable that a chopper wouldn't have flown as smoothly back then as, say, 1977. So I don't know. But as we say with a lot of movies, suspension of disbelief. Fair enough. I like the prologue. It's an interesting prologue where we just get these quick introductions to these characters that seem to have nothing to do with each other except that they're criminals. We've got one guy, the fastest one. He's apparently a hitman in Mexico. We just see him very quickly take care of business, murdering somebody and leaving. We get a French guy that doesn't seem like he's too bad of a dude. He's living a pretty good life, but then you find out he's basically living a good life because he and his brother-in-law or somebody have been, I think, embezzling or something, committing fraud of some degree from the company they work for. So they've been living high on the hog by doing that. Now they're finally going to be found out. And the guy's like, don't worry, we'll figure it out. But then he bails on him by shooting himself. Yeah. And he thinks we also get a scene of him with his wife before that. Not the guy that kills himself, the character. And basically he has to flee the country. So he doesn't get caught for that. What else is there? Oh, we have a guy who's a terrorist that takes part in a bombing in Jerusalem. And he sees the special forces take out all of his accomplices, but he manages to get away, so he has to get out. And then finally, we have our American, played by Roy Scheider, who's part of an Irish gang that commits robberies, and they commit a very bad robbery because they actually rob a church during a wedding, and the church happens to be the priest of the church. His brother is an Italian mob boss, so it's a terrible thing. And in there, he's driving the getaway car, and they crash and they all die except for him. He manages to get away, but not only are the authorities looking for him, he also finds out that the mafia guy is looking for him too, and that's a big deal. So they all have reasons to disappear, although again, it seems incredible that they would all wind up in such a remote, small place. The fact that they even show up in the same country would be amazing, but the same tiny little village. But whatever, that's fine. It's a neat enough idea, right?
Do we actually know where this is? Because other than Central America, I don't have any idea what country this is.
I don't know either. I don't know what the country's supposed to be. The name of the village itself is like fiction. It's fictional, like it's not real. So I guess they're just saying it could be anywhere in Central America, which is fair enough because even to this day, most people's knowledge of Central America is pretty much the same thing. It's basically third world conditions, and the government is usually in some form of flux. If there's not some sort of full on revolution going on with militias and stuff. That's basically been the state of Central America for the past 100 years.
That's not untrue for quite a few of those countries.
Yeah. I mean, places like Costa Rica, they're doing pretty well and stuff. But it is true with some of the other ones, it is kind of madness there, and the state of confusion and chaos and poverty is very much highlighted in this. The fact that this village itself is doing very poorly. Everybody has a pretty crappy standard of living. The police force is predictably corrupt. Also, even a few hundred miles down the road where this factory is, which a lot of their economy relies on, it's basically inferred there's two main possibilities for why the explosion happened. Either horrible safety precautions, which seems to fit, or it was bombed by terrorists that are trying to incite against the government. Either one seems incredibly plausible given the situation. So they let us know that right out the fact. And it is interesting to see, even though they don't do much of it, the initial scenes where we see these guys and how different their lives have become living in this place. They're just basically doing hard labor. And one of them is part of this group. And he, speaking of horrible safety conditions, he's on the job when one of his coworkers is horrifically injured. They're moving some sort of big thing through the water or something. I don't know. But anyway, he winds up being injured right in front of him. It's very bad. And so, yeah, it's a very hard luck place, part of the world. And the idea is all of them at this point, they were here to lie low, except for the assassin who seems to just be passing through. It's never really explained. I think his name is Nico, the assassin. He's not necessarily hiding out. It's like he just came to pass through, and then he takes the job for the hell of it because he's that kind of guy. Whereas the other three, now that they're here, they've been here for a few months, but they really like to leave now. But they need a certain amount of money to do it. And then this job, which is a very dangerous job, pops up for them, and it would give them the opportunity to do it, which is why they take it. So, I mean, it's an interesting enough setup, and it does have its things about fate. It has its comparisons to some other films, some better-known films, particularly I read about how compared to The Treasure of Sierra Madre. In fact, that's what Roy Scheider's character is supposed to be like modeled after. That's why they try to make him look a certain way and act a certain way, is sort of be like Humphrey Bogart's character in that. And as different as they are in premise, they do have sort of a setup in that, you've got like sort of hard, desperate men put in like a hard, desperate situation, and they have to pull together or they'll fail type thing. So yeah, I get that. It's maybe not the best version you can come up with that for, but sure.
Yeah, how did you feel about the casting?
It's hard to say because I think like a lot of people, it being international, I just don't know these actors, right? At least they're going for some authenticity. But so they were doing foreign actors. We got Roy Scheider, the American, but then we've got these other foreign actors who most audiences over here just really wouldn't be familiar with unless they did stuff later on. Like in the case of the French fellow, he would get more well-known when he was older for a TV show that he did, but that was well before this. So, I mean, I didn't have any problem with the casting. It just seems like, again, part of how it makes the movie kind of a risk in that it doesn't have a lot of star power.
Yeah, I think that's because, well, I mean, Scheider, I guess, but aside from him, that's pretty much it. I think they wanted, what do they want, Steve McQueen to be in the lead role?
Oh, yeah, that would have been cool. I didn't know that.
That's what he freaking wanted, but he would only do it if his wife could co-star with him.
Oh, and, yeah, there's no real female parts in this.
Like that, so
just good parts.
But I was reading that it got some flack because of all the the beginning of the film has a lot of subtitled scenes that are taking place in another country in a different language, and people felt like they were tricked into watching a foreign film, so they had to get these posters printed up. It said, "Your attention, please, to dramatize the diverse backgrounds of the principal characters. 2 of the opening sequences were filmed in the appropriate foreign languages." with
Man.
subtitles in English. It's pretty
Doesn't
crazy.
that just make you sad about the society we live in, where it's almost pretty much still much the same nowadays, where people are just like, subtitles, forget that, you know?
It said, other than these opening scenes, Sorcerer is an English language film. But I mean, it's like a solid probably 30 minutes of foreign language stuff in the beginning, which was probably one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Yeah, they're really well done. It's too bad they're not a little, like, I get why they're brief in a way. It's just sort of they're brief, they're impactful to get out. But honestly, one of my main criticisms of the movie is it feels a little thin to me. It feels like the bigger story being told besides Fate here is we could have had some character development, and we get almost none.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I feel like it had too much to tell because you had to set all these characters up. You know, it was a lot of exposition right out of the gate.
Sure.
You know, and that took a good bit. I mean, that was probably 35, 45 minutes, you know, before you even get to this random Central American country. And, you know, then the movie actually starts, which I think it came in just a little under 2 hours, but probably could have easily gone, you know, longer than that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it would have benefited from having a few more scenes of them once they're in the country, just them interacting it, because we get very little. Now I get it. They're criminals. They're not good men. They're not the type of men that are going to get together and babble their life stories to each other. I get that. But I still wish there was a little bit something approaching that, and there's very little. And the closest we get is abruptly cut off. Not that that's a bad thing. It's done very effectively, and it's dramatic and stuff. I know a lot of people watching this probably haven't seen the movie. I hadn't seen the movie before this either, and it's always good if we can recommend you to see the movie. But we are doing full spoilers here for the sake of doing a thorough job. So we are going to have to tell you some stuff that could lessen your enjoyment watching the movie for the first time. But we've got characters dying and stuff, and I think that we were finally on our way to some of good character development when we had the French fellow talking to the Middle Eastern guy.
That totally threw me off, man. I was like,
and that's when their truck just goes up.
They're having this conversation and the tire blows, and then they fly off and the truck explodes.
And I get it. I don't think it's bad. I think it helps with the whole Fate thing, because they just come through two very difficult situations: the thing with the bridge, and then the thing with the barrier. And then now it shows that, like, they're on the road and everything seems fine, but then, you know, there's nothing they could have done. Tire blows out, and that's the end of them. And I get the point it's making. It's very true. These guys weren't careless. It's not like they weren't good enough. Something out of their control happened, and that was that. And lines up with the whole Fate thing, and you feel bad. And it's very effective because you're starting to sort of feel something for them, and boom, they're gone.
Exactly.
But I just wish there was a bit more before that, because I don't expect men like this to all come together and hug and kumbaya. But I still wish there was a bit more sort of a bonding, or a bit more feeling each other out and stuff. A couple of them barely interact with each other at all. It seems like that's a missed opportunity, that you've got a couple of them that barely even say two words to each other.
We need some more, like, diner scenes with them in a diner talking about tipping.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a good idea.
You know, something.
Reservoir Dog style.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is, if Tarantino had done this movie, he would have gotten some of those scenes in.
Oh, that would have been it. That would have been, and there would have been 3 minutes of them driving the truck, which may not have been a bad thing. I don't know. It was quite a bit of trucks on bridges and various objects.
Yeah. I mean, I get that that's supposed to be like the main action of the film, but I think some of it is a little drawn out.
Yeah. A little boring to me, I think.
And partly, I don't know how audience would have seen it at the time, but we've been a little spoiled. Because when I was watching the whole truck on a bridge thing, I was thinking, yeah, it must have been sort of impressive how they filmed it back in the day.
Yeah.
But it didn't quite have, as you said, quite the amount of suspense and drama. Because we've seen better things. I was thinking, even in a movie that I don't think is very good, but I thought was done well. Because I always thought the master of, like, writing scenarios where, like, everything's going wrong and people have to, like, fix the problem was Michael Crichton. And one of the best ones he did was in The Lost World. And they do, as much as the movie pisses all over the book, one thing it does well from the book is the whole scene where the T-Rexes attack their big camper and is hanging off the cliff. You know, and I was thinking about how that scene is actually so much better and so much more dramatic. And all these things are, because Michael Crichton understood that it wasn't just sort of one thing. You had the trailer hanging off the cliff. That was the danger. The danger was that it would fall off the cliff. But even though that was the end result, new problems kept springing up during it. Because it's like they fell to a different position, what they were pulling on snapped, the guy having to run the winch around the tree and his issues, the glass is about to break. You had all these things happening. Whereas with the truck, it's kind of static. It's the same idea as the hanging off the cliff. The truck is on the unstable bridge. It can either fall off the bridge, fall through the bridge, or of course, too much friction and explode. That's there, but at the same time, it's just a truck plodding across the bridge.
Man, the bridge is on the poster. So I guess they did that because it was so hard to film that one scene.
Mm-hmm.
It was, it was that's what Friedkin says was the hardest shot to film in his career.
It must have been. I mean, it looked very difficult.
Because they had built the thing, and then they were having a drought in the Dominican Republic, so they had to go find another location and rebuild, which cost $1 million. And then the truck kept sliding off of the bridge, and it took 3 months to shoot. So that right there is one of the reasons this film was crazy over budget.
Yeah. As it turns out, I think, like, I'm not sure what would have been better, but when they were picking locations like Dominican Republic, as it turns out, was kind of an unfortunate one that they had some roadblocks there that they might not have had somewhere else and stuff, but they just sort of had to follow through with what they picked. But yeah, as I said, you get the stakes there. You get why it's tense and stuff, but it doesn't translate as well on film because it just feels static. The truck's on the bridge. I mean, they do add a bit of a problem when the guy falls through and he can't hear him. You think maybe he's going to run him over, but it just still feels like it's too unchanging. It's okay. The truck is trying to get from point A to point B, and it's taking a long time. And I don't know. I wouldn't have minded if they'd thrown in some extra shit. Like, I don't know. It was during a downpour, so let's have like lightning hit a tree and a tree falls on the bridge or something. Add some more stuff to it. I think is
sure.
Because if you were in that situation in real life, sure, that'd be all the drama you need. But for audiences like us, I think we needed a bit more. Or if you're just going to do it that way, then at least make it go a little quicker because it seems to take too long.
Absolutely.
But, there was one thing, having watched the movie just today, and I thought I watched it pretty carefully, there was one thing, it's not a big deal, but that I missed on, was so initially before Nico, the assassin, gets there, you've got some other guy that doesn't have an intro or anything, but he's obviously hiding out too. He's the German guy named who they call Marquez, who is sort of friends with the Middle Eastern guy, Kassem. And of course, Nico murders him and takes his place. That's how he gets there. He murders him and takes his place just for the hell of it, I guess. But I mean, when I was reading about it and stuff, they said that it was implied that he had been a Nazi who was hiding out. But I didn't see anything.
Wow.
I didn't see anything that confirmed that. Like, I didn't see anything or hear anything. Like, did I miss something? Because, I mean, when they show him dead and the blood is on him, you see, like, an iron cross, but that doesn't necessarily make you think Nazi. He was German.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Because, I mean, I'd read about it. So then when Nico had killed him and the guy was rushing at him, I thought he was going to say, hey, he was Nazi scum or something like that. But no, he doesn't say anything. It's just like, I killed him and took his job because killing people is what I do. Which, I mean, I get. He's a hitman. And that's one of the points of the movie is, like, none of these guys are really good guys. They're all criminals who have done bad things, although they're all varying. They've all done sort of different levels of bad. And so, going back to the fate thing, it's kind of like, well, maybe that's just fate catching up with them. They tried to run away from their sins, but they still wound up paying anyway, because, full spoilers here again, all our characters do wind up dying, 3 in the attempt and then 1 afterwards. Roy Scheider, much like in real life, is the one that outlived them all. The other guys have all passed away in real life. Roy Scheider is still with us, I believe. Isn't he?
Is he?
Oh, he's not?
I don't think so. Okay,
I think he died the last then. Because I remember him being in like an episode of Family Guy a few years ago, and these other guys kicked off. These other guys kicked off well before that. I think the last one was 2001.
Maybe I'm wrong. I thought he passed away. Yeah, 2008.
Yeah. Okay. 2008. Okay. Yeah, but he definitely, yeah, well, just like in real life, he outlived the others in real life.
He outlived that damn shark too.
That's what matters.
Smile. But I really, well, I guess we can get back to that. But I didn't like the casting of Roy Scheider. I just didn't feel like he was able to fit this role. But like you said, I hadn't heard this, but he was trying to play some Bogart role.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, yeah, sort of an imitation.
That may explain, that may explain why it was kind of odd to me the way he was playing the role.
I think that's true. I think they had sort of a very specific, as we said, sort of like Treasure of Sierra Madre character that Bogart did. And then they had probably different people they wanted for it. And they wound up with Scheider, who was not really suited for it. He gave it his best shot, and it didn't exactly work. Because out of the four, he's the one that lasts the longest, and he's the one that we get sort of the most characterization of. And they're almost trying to say like maybe he's the most heroic because he does finish off. But at the same time, the French guy, sure, he's kind of a scumbag because nobody who lives in the world and follows the rules and works at their job is going to feel that sympathetic for a person that basically breaks the rules and cheats so they can get their way, as this French guy did. At the same time, we have to remember that Roy Scheider was part of a violent robbery where they actually murder a priest.
Oh, yeah.
And now he's not the trigger man. There's a part where he's talking to the guy that's going to help get him out of the country. And he's saying about how the mob guy is out for his blood. And he says, you know, I never carry a gun. As if that excuses it. Would that make you feel any better? If you found out that there were 4 guys that did a violent robbery that murdered your brother, 3 of them died, including the one that killed him. But the other guy, he's not the one who killed him, so who cares? I wouldn't feel better. I'd have a lot of animosity too.
Yeah.
Maybe he's just the driver, but it's not like there's no scene of him going, "Oh, don't shoot the guy" or anything like that. Or
yeah, that was a pretty disturbing scene, I thought too. Not only because it was just, a ridiculous pile of money in this church, but they just
sort of find out why. It does make sense. The mafia guy thinks it's a perfect place to hide his money. Yeah, I buy that.
But yeah, it makes sense.
But also, he doesn't die right away, right? That they shoot him, and he's just going, "Oh."
They got us. Oh, they hit us.
Yeah.
But so at the end, Roy Scheider, he essentially loses his mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
He goes crazy and starts having flashbacks of everything. And
which I don't think, again, is done very well because it's too fast. You can't have characters losing their mind if you're going to do it like with just a couple of flashes here and there over like 2 or 3 minutes. It's too fast. If you want to convince me that a character's losing their mind, you have to give me sort of a slow, gradual build-up of it. People don't just snap. They do, but this is a different sort of snapping, right? This isn't like him. I don't know. Anyway, maybe what I said wasn't valid, but I still feel it's valid that it was too fast the way they did in the movie.
Sure.
I didn't really buy it. There not enough. We didn't see enough.
He did almost cut someone's head off with a shovel like minutes before. So I can understand he's been through a little bit, but
yeah, that would add to the stress for sure. It's already the most stressful job in the world, driving a big, unwieldy truck full of nitro down like the least developed roads in the world. Because we don't have to tell the audience, but obviously, this is some weird backwater Central American country. There's no paved roads. It's all dirt roads. They're all narrow. Sometimes near the beginning, they're all windy up on like cliffs and stuff. Like it's like the most, it's the most stressful thing you can imagine.
But he eventually makes it there with one box. He's just
on foot.
Right?
He makes it on foot because the truck breaks down. Then he sort of gets to feel like a hero for a brief period of time, and you get the idea that maybe he's a low life like the rest of them. This is sort of, even though he did it for himself, he still did help people. It was sort of like the first maybe good thing he'd done in his life, and you get to see a brief bit of some of the gratitude from the people there, that they're happy that he did it and he delivered it and stuff, and he doesn't get to enjoy it for very long.
So we talked about the score a little bit, the Tangerine Dream. They hit you with that electronic synth. So what did you think there at the end when, the guy showed up from or was it Boston or somewhere, at the beginning. And,
yeah, the gang guys.
Yeah, and they hit with that tangerine dream synth.
It doesn't seem right to me. No.
It
almost seems like the movie turned into something else.
I thought I had another tab open on my computer, and I was like, "Whoa, what's going on?
What's that sound?
Hold on, that's coming from over here." Wait, no, that's the movie. Okay, I had to do a double take. But, I didn't dislike the track. It just, like I said earlier, I didn't think it was appropriate for the scene.
No, I don't know. It made me think of like, I don't know, Goblin doing an Argento film or something.
Exactly.
Except what we watched was not, the movie is kind of old world, old school. It's like old, as we said, like the Treasure Sierra Madre kind of setup. It's set in the now, but it could have been set like decades before because it's sort of a timeless type of story. As long as you've got trucks, anyway, trucks are a big part. I love the trucks though. The trucks were really great looking trucks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I used to think that the truck in Duel was like the best truck. I think these trucks are better than the truck in Duel. I thought they were really interesting, cool trucks. I like how they already have this impossible, dangerous job to do, and the fact is they don't even have good trucks. They just have to like make Frankenstein trucks out of pieces of dead trucks. Like everything is stacked against them, which is great.
They could have called this movie Trucks, and it would have been better. It would have been a better title.
It would have been a better title.
Frankenstein Trucks. I would watch that.
Sure.
What's that? The guy that did The Exorcist is doing the Frankenstein trucks? Let's go check it out. Fuck Star Wars. I want to see this.
It could have been. But also there is a line early in the movie that does help sum things up, although it's easy to forget. Besides the whole thing about fate, because that's true too, because the world is full of people who don't know each other and don't have reason to necessarily like or trust each other, but to succeed often we have to try, and that's what these men wind up doing. They're kind of bad men. They're here for bad reasons, but for whatever their intentions or whatever their reason, there's something they have to do that would be actually good, and the only way they're going to get through it is by trying to get along or cooperate, etc., and put the other stuff aside. But the other thing was what I thought was interesting, because in addition to saying, well, they're bad men, is it doesn't tell the whole story, because people aren't that simple. It's at the beginning. Our French guy is having a conversation with his wife, and she's reading a poem, and it says something about like a French Foreign Legion guy, and something about how he's been ordered to murder a civilian, and he's conflicted about it. But then in the end, he does shoot the civilian, and she's telling him, and he says from the other room, he's listening to her, he says, "Oh, well, then he turned out to be just another soldier," and she says, "People aren't just something," which is kind of, I think, what the movie's about too. It's okay, we've seen sort of the bad side of these guys, but most people aren't just good or bad. People are usually a mix, and there's more to them. And even though what we saw is this guy's a murderer, and this guy's a thief, and this guy's a terrorist, like, that's not all they are. There's more to them. And the point of what we're seeing is to show us a little bit of that. And the movie, I guess, succeeds in that. But again, I think it could have done better if it had fleshed it out a little more. I feel like they held stuff back. There was some more stuff they could have layered on here. And I don't mean making it a super long movie. Just a few other scenes. Maybe another 15 minutes would have done it. Even.
Yeah, I agree. They could have taken out some of the truck stuff.
Yeah, shortened it down a bit.
I don't know. I told you before that, I'd seen this movie and I didn't really care for it. I only watched it because of William Friedkin. He's one of my favorite directors. And this is one of his that, you hear that title and you're like, okay, what could this possibly be?
Especially when it shows like the weird logo that was on the truck and it has the electronic music. It's like a Sorcerer. Like, oh yeah. And then you get sort of this old school adventure film that feels more like it fits with like the serials of the 30s, like an Indiana Jones type thing,
Yeah, exactly.
Like gritty, disparate men, big trucks, and big heavy guns and those sorts of things. Like nothing that's of Sorcerer evokes.
Yeah, just a few. I mean, not necessarily a bad movie at all.
No,
just I feel like some of the marketing didn't help for sure, and Star Wars.
Mm-hmm. Some of its timing, marketing.
considerably. Heard it.
It has a good visual style. I like how the camera pulls back and lets us see these environments really fully. But when it's in the beginning, when we're on the characters, the camera's very centered on them. I think, as you said, the whole opening prologue with each character introduction is probably the best part of the movie. It grabs you right away. Each character is distinct and interesting. And then you're wondering, oh, what's this all going to have to do with? And it seems like it's going to be more interesting when they're together, but I don't know if it is. I don't think the movie sort of delivers what it promises. It seems more like it would have been more interesting to see these guys go on to do things separately than come together in this Central American place and drive trucks. But
drive trucks,
like show the people hunting them down or something, which is eventually how our hero Roy Scheider dies. He's the one, he survives against all odds, gets it in, and then having a celebratory drink at the end, he's tracked down by the mob guys, and it turns out he was sold out by his own friend, who had seen him off because his friend is one of the people in the car. And you wonder how much of a friend this guy is, because I thought he was going to wait outside. He doesn't even wait outside. He goes in to watch him get killed, so he'll know. I mean, if you're that kind of jerk that would sell out your friend, you would at least think, well, I'll stay out here. At least he won't have to die knowing I betrayed him. But no, I'm going to go in and say hi. Hey, I betrayed you. Bye now. I mean, I guess if you're going to do that dick thing, go full dick. Go all the way.
Sure, yeah. Look him in the eyes.
We never get any backstory. We never know, like, if it's because they paid him or threatened him. Nothing. It's just, well, here he is. He betrayed you. The gunshot could have been a little louder too, because I was waiting for the gunshot, and then like when I heard it, I was like, "Was that the gunshot?" And then the movie ended. I was like, "I guess it was." I didn't hear it very well. Maybe that's just a little nitpick.
Did you notice that the bride at the beginning, she had a black eye? Well, of course you did. They zoomed in on it, yeah. But,
yeah. Which is just one of those weird details too. It's just like, here's your typical Jersey wedding. Yeah. I guess is what you're trying to tell us.
Exactly.
New Jersey, it's a great place. where abused brides marry their abusers, and mafia priests get murdered, and Irish guys crash cars. It's a wonderful melting pot.
I'm almost more intrigued by that side of the movie than any of the shit going on in South America. Like, I want to see more of that. Show me more of Jersey.
Yeah. Listen to this. Gerard Murphy, who portrayed the head of the Irish gang during the church robbery, was a real-life criminal involved in a similar heist in real life. So what? They cast him because he had, like, real experience, I guess.
Oh, I actually did this. Oh, really? Okay, you'll play robber number 3.
That's pretty funny. But Friedkin himself has a soft spot for the movie, which seems like a lot of these directors do. And I get what they were going for, and some of it's carried off. I don't think they got, like you said, I don't think Roy Scheider, he's a good actor, and I enjoy seeing him and stuff. I don't think he's quite what the role calls for. He does his best, but he falls a little flat. Repeating myself, but I think it could have used a few more scenes fleshing out these guys interacting and getting to know each other at least a little bit. They don't have to tell each other their past lives or anything. They can just talk. They talk, but I don't think quite enough. I would have liked to seen a little more bonding or whatever you want to call it. Because if you're going to off characters, you want to care about them a little and not just show that they're terrible. I get the whole fate thing, but if you're going to swallow that whole thing about fate, you want it to at least mean something. I guess it still meant something, but still, I just feel like they could have put more layers on it, added more to it. It would have had a better impact, I think. Just give us a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, a few tweaks one way or the other. I mean, this film could have been really good.
Mm-hmm.
William Friedkin has stated that the strange title of the film refers to the evil wizard of fate.
Yeah, like I said, it's sort of a reach. He's trying to tie in the fate thing. And,
that's a reach.
And when you're doing that, I think it just hurts you, because it's not, you're not doing an art house film here. And I think that's how some of the people maybe even came away from it. You know, it's not really an art house film feel, but they're watching the first few minutes with the subtitles and stuff like that,
yeah.
and then they have no idea why it's called Sorcerer. So there's probably a lot of people that thought like he was going for something a lot more artistic than he actually was.
I paid to see fucking trucks, not to hear Not to read words on the screen.
I mean, it's some interesting quotes here. I was saying about how they didn't do enough character development. Director, the line, action is character. I don't remember anybody saying that, but apparently somebody says that in the movie. And maybe that's how I sort of thought. One of my themes is that there's good and evil in everyone. It's not out to make these guys heroes. I really believe in the heroes. Don't really believe in heroes. The best people have dark side, and it's constant struggle for the better side to survive and thrive. Yeah, we already talked about that. Sorry, I thought that quote was going somewhere else. We already talked about that. But I'm trying to think what else is going on here. But yeah, the film jumps around just like at the beginning, just like they had to do. They actually did film the French stuff in Paris. They filmed, I think, in Jerusalem. So they had to hop around a bit before they wound up doing their main stuff in Dominican Republic. So you can see how that jumps the budget up.
Absolutely. They would never do that now. They would film all that shit in like a set in California somewhere.
Because California is the best actor of all places. It can just play anything. Look at California. California can play the Midwest. California can play the Far East. Whatever you want. California can play it.
Yeah.
But and that's kind of funny too, because that was, I don't want to say a symptom, but that was something that, as you said, they don't necessarily do that now, and they didn't do it before. It was sort of a more rare thing, an authenticity thing they really did in the New Hollywood era. It was a sort of a new thing to really shoot on location. And as we said, it's not a bad thing, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. As he said, he was partly inspired to do something like this because of what George Lucas and Coppola had done in the Philippines to make Apocalypse Now. So you can see how it can work, and you can see how it's a risk that can backfire too. And speaking of which, about how the failure, or whatever you want to call it, or the disappointment of this and other movies led to studios sort of reasserting their control. Another thing about the movie is because of the way the budget went, this movie wasn't produced by one studio. It was sort of a joint venture between Universal and Paramount. They had to involve both of them because of the expenses. They had to get both involved to foot the bill, which I don't think was common at all. So there was another issue.
You wouldn't think that would be common.
No. Because, yeah, when I saw the Universal thing come up and then Paramount, I thought, wait a second, those are two of the big ones. Because usually you see, like, Universal, and then you might see, like, some lesser, smaller production company under it. You don't expect to see two of the big ones come in. And they're two of the old school big ones, too, that ruled before the days of old Hollywood, where there was basically a 5-studio system. Universal, what do we got? I have to think of them now. Oh, it's going to drive me nuts. Universal and Paramount are two of them. Fox is another one. Oh, MGM, and then the one that died, RKO.
Well, MGM died too, didn't
it? More recently, but RKO was basically done by the 70s.
Oh, sure.
Most people don't even know what RKO is unless they're somebody that watches old movies. But they were a big power back in the day, especially for silent movies. But yes, this is 1977. We see this and a few of these other films. Again, there's still some great successes that are coming out. Most notably Star Wars. Also in 77, a similar type of thing. Spielberg hitting another one out of the park with Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So by no means was the movement necessarily sliding out of control or flopping, but it was just enough cracks to really bring on the change. And as we said, for somebody as good as most of these directors, they still survived it anyway.
Sure.
Even though New Hollywood would sort of end and turn into whatever the next era was, most of these directors we're talking about were good enough or successful enough that when the era ended, they adapted and still continued to make successful films well after, going, into the 80s, 90s, and today. But just trying to think, yeah. But the whole idea of a director having sort of limitless control was nearing the end. Not that these directors had limitless, but still they were getting ideas and input and and stuff like that that is more or less restricted nowadays, unless you have a lot of clout, and even then nobody's above the rules or whatever you want to call it. Because that's another thing about William Friedkin in particular. Once you get into the second half of his career, not just him, but I can't think of anybody's name anymore. Oh, Robert Altman's another one. Robert Altman's probably the most famous, and that Robert Altman almost disappeared off the face of the map because he couldn't get people to finance his movies anymore. Like, he didn't do anything in the 80s pretty much because he couldn't get funding anywhere. He went over to Europe and stuff. So that was sort of the price that had been paid when you saw the collapse of New Hollywood. You saw these studios being much more cautious, to the point that certain directors, even very capable directors like Altman or Friedkin, were suddenly they're struggling to get the funding they need to do the projects that they plan on doing.
Yeah. That's what happens. I mean, it's just, it can't go on forever. You've got a few, failures like this, and, they're get scared with their money.
Sure.
And, you had, the economy in the United States was kind of, up and down around this period of time too. So
oh, absolutely.
I'm sure that probably played into some of this as well.
Mm-hmm. Plus, even though the movie doesn't sound as ambitious when you talk about it, when you break down the stuff they actually had to do, it was quite ambitious. And that was the other thing. In this rush for authenticity and stuff like that, well, that it all looks great, but it's technical and difficult to do, and it's expensive. And that's the other thing that makes the studios more and more nervous going forward, because some of the stuff that you can do nowadays just didn't exist back then. It was either get the shot or you don't. Whereas nowadays it's like, well, this isn't working, but we can at least half-ass it in post with, this sort of editing technique or this sort of computer graphic and stuff like that. So at least now studios have, even though that costs money in itself, it's still kind of a backdoor, kind of a safety net type thing where it costs less at least. And you'll see movies being half-assed the entire way, where studios just rub their hands together in glee and just be like, we can just green screen all of this, because sure, that costs money, but it doesn't cost near the money that doing these things practically would do. And Sorcerer had quite a few problematic scenes that, sure, the studio might have been all for if they thought the movie was going to be a huge success, but since it wasn't, as you said, it becomes more cautious thing. Things going on in Dominican Republic, having some problems with the detonation of the tree, not having enough explosives, and just looking at a few different things here.
Yeah, just a lot of things added up to a bloated budget.
Mm-hmm. A few times where he wanted to reshoot some stuff and clashed with them about that. Just looking at that, Freakin had some sort of feud with the chief, with the Teamsters that were involved.
Oh, wow. That's never good.
5 production managers were fired, upsetting Scheider. Is something else? Yeah, so the litany I see of personal problems behind the scenes, somebody going through a divorce, or possibly being worried he was going to get divorced. Let's see here. In Tuxtepec, Mexico, where the suspension bridge film was seen, an undercover federal agent informed Friedkin that several of his crew members, including grip crewmen, stuntmen, and makeup artists, were in the possession of drugs and could face prison sentences.
I can believe it.
So, yeah, all sorts of issues going on.
Yeah, not my favorite. Freaking.
As you said, it's funny how they went to you said how they had to go to the lengths to put special notices up to let people know that it wasn't a foreign language film and stuff. They also had to do the same thing when we were talking about the title, just to let people know that it was not a film about the supernatural, because that's what most people were expecting, particularly because it was his next movie after The Exorcist. So, Sorcerer, here we go. So yeah, so there's some more confusion and
it's a sequel.
There.
Sequel to The Exorcist.
Film critic Gene Siskel thought Sorcerer was a very bad title. That's
I don't
very
disagree.
yeah.
That is a bad title. I don't know why they didn't just use the original title of the original film, whatever that was.
Wages of Fear, was it?
Something like that. I mean, that works better.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not great, but it's better than what they went with.
Yeah. It has some good scenes. It just never holds together as a whole, I think, is the problem. And I think a few more scenes tying things up and adding some layers to the characters might have helped. But yeah, it's certainly a good film in some ways. But you can definitely understand how it has its problems.
Yeah.
Plus, it's hard to find an audience for a film like this when there's so much confusion around what it's actually about. Not to mention the competition of other films, and of course, as we noted, the breakout success of Star Wars at the exact same time. So, just sort of it's easy to understand how this film could just sort of get buried below everything else, and nobody even really noticing it. Like Roy Scheider's in that, the Jaws guy, okay, and then after that, it sort of falls off. But I don't have any problem with any of the other casting. I think it's kind of nice that it went with some sort of authenticity there with some foreign actors. And to their credit, I mean, you don't know, because as we said, with a lot of these new Hollywood films, they didn't necessarily cast names at the time. They would just turn out to be breakout stars. That wasn't the case in this film, unfortunately. But it did happen in other films. But where lots of films from this era cast people that would have been unknowns at the time, and nowadays are household names because they were breakout performers in those films. And again, this isn't necessarily anything to do specifically with these actors. There's just all sorts of different factors going into it, many of which we've already noted. Yeah, here's a good quote that I think is true too. There's somebody from Miami News. Sorcerer's dialogue is kept to such a minimum that not only you don't feel for these four losers, but you never really get to know them, which is kind of how I feel. There just needed to be more dialogue. There needed to be more interaction between these guys. They don't have to necessarily make us root for them, but if they want to make that point, like I think they're trying, that people aren't just something, that there's more to them, then show us a little more instead of showing us this introduction, showing their criminal elements, showing the criminal side of them, and then we just sort of get this thrown into a desperate situation side of them. There has to be kind of something in between, and there's very little of it. Just at the beginning, we get to see the little lives they settled into in this village. I think there should have been a little more of that too.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I was feeling it. I was feeling it at that point. It was the place starts out. I was like, okay, yeah. Now they're in like a really different place. This place is really down on its luck. It's a very tough place to be in, and you can see, and it's obviously a small area. And I do like how a couple of them have the conversation, and he says to him when he's talking to the French guy, he says like, the rumors are that you were a banker. And he said, I didn't know that there were rumors about me. But you can totally understand why, because you got two like foreign white guys showing up in this village. So obviously people are going to talk about them or have opinions and theories on them. And I just think there should have been a bit more of it, a little bit more of it.
Yeah. You got plenty of scenes with nitroglycerin and tension.
Yeah, I mean, they have to get that across, and they do a good enough job of it. It's a weird movie because it feels like it's torn between a few different worlds, which is maybe another reason why it was a hard thing for audiences to wrap their heads around. Because on one hand, it seems almost like it's going to be sort of like this stylish, slick, foreign-esque thriller. It starts off that way. But then it turns into something that's more old-school pulp. And I'm not saying you can't marry those things. In fact, there's a lot to be gained in marrying those things. But there's probably movies that do a better job of it than this one, I guess, is kind of what I think.
Yeah, totally.
Anyway, the place is called Porvenir, the little village.
Oh.
But I'm pretty sure that's made up. I don't think that's an actual place. But it's another one of those films, and anytime we talk about a film that didn't do too well, it's usually because we also want to say that over time, audiences did come back to it, or a certain critical group found favor with it. And this movie is another one of those, although I think you and I are both sort of lukewarm. We don't necessarily think it deserves a lot of praise or anything like that, but it also doesn't deserve to be completely cast aside either. But nowadays it has a better reputation, and there's people that have come around and given it praise for various things, including some of the stuff that we said.
Yeah.
You know, I've never read the novel, but some people have said that it actually does a better job than the novel, which is fair enough, although from what I've read, the 53 movie is better in pretty much every way. But
it's considered a cult film, which I don't really like that terminology of a film that was on such a large scale like that. I feel like it's not really appropriate when you talk about a film that cost $20 million to make.
Mm-hmm.
But it is considered a cult classic.
Yeah. No, I don't know either. Like I think the best like reassessment I could give it is probably, you know, when you're looking at Friedkin's films, like that maybe you see this as some sort of hole or some sort of bomb, and you could say, well, it's actually not that. You could say it's not really bad. It's not some terrible piece of shit that he made and set him back. It was more sort of an underwhelming film that had various circumstances against it and various things that it carried off well and various other things it didn't carry off so well, and how that all mixes together and can work against you, because let's face it, it's hard to have a hit. You need a lot of things to go right.
Yeah, absolutely.
You need a lot of things to go right.
You need a lot of luck and a lot of money.
Here we go. This is a film that Quentin Tarantino likes. He ranked it in some sort of poll for Sight and Sound.
I think you can find that on just about every movie on Earth.
Yeah. I mean, if there's anybody that's able to like find like positives in a movie, it's Quentin Tarantino. There's always it'd be some terrible movie you've never heard of and something like that, but Quentin Tarantino remembers one scene where they did this really well, and he just loves it and fixates it on it to the point that he has to bring it up in this movie. And I get that, because this movie does remind me a little bit of even though it's New Hollywood, although I guess they're sort of part of the graduation into it, was it even has a little bit of some of the pulp stuff. It sort of also is reminiscent of some of the spaghetti western stuff. It's too bad, not to shit all over Roy Scheider because he's a good enough guy, but if you could have gotten maybe a more gritty guy in there, as we said, they were considering like a guy like Clint Eastwood or something. I think maybe Clint Eastwood's too far, but some sort of mix in between. You know, Roy Scheider's. You know, I think I almost said Indiana Jones. Harrison Ford would have been good, except he would have been a little too young at the time. But I feel like if they made the movie in 1984 or 85, Harrison Ford would have been really good for it, maybe. Or maybe it's just because I just associate him with those old style trucks because of the convoy scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. There he is on the truck. I don't know. Some things are hard to separate in my mind when you're as big Indiana Jones and Harrison Ford fan as I am.
Sure.
But Harrison Ford was too young and clean cut back then. It's amazing how young and clean cut he looks in. It's amazing. Yeah, if you watch him in Apocalypse Now, which came out in '79, although honestly his scene might have been filmed well before that, and then you see him as Indiana Jones in '81. Like it just seems worlds apart, even though it's only a couple of years. Because the first time I ever saw Apocalypse Now, I thought it was a lot older. I thought it was like 5 or 6 years older than that. And part of the reason was I just thought Harrison Ford looked really young in it.
Yeah.
But that is a movie that had a fairly long shooting time. I'm not sure how long. But see, again, that's another thing. That's a movie that had kind of all the recipe, had all the ingredients to like totally fail and stuff. But it just happened to be a really great movie, so everything worked out and paid off because it was a long production. It was in foreign countries. A lot of difficult stuff happening. Brando being Brando amongst them and stuff like that. Martin Sheen had a freaking heart attack. Like all sorts of terrible things happened and could have worked against the movie. But it was a really great movie, so it all worked out and paid off. But as we said, by the time we got to it, we were getting to a point where studios were less likely to allow that kind of freedom to these filmmakers because of the risk involved.
Yeah. We're talking about the days when, Dennis Hopper would just get like $5 million and go do a bunch of cocaine for a couple of years. And, he may give you a movie, he may not. That's the time period we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. This is interesting, too. It's not just the fact that Star Wars came out at the same time, but in the opinion of several critics, some remarked that Star Wars marked a distinctive demographic shift among the audiences, as well as altered trends in movies, which I think is true, too, because this movie kind of had sort of a really old-school pulp feel. And Star Wars,
totally see that, yeah.
Despite the fact that everything about Star Wars relies on old stuff like westerns and samurai films and that, it still had this very new kind of like, this is the new adventure type thing. And it was like people were looking for the new, and this movie didn't feel like that. So even though this is New Hollywood and had plenty of the same elements, it didn't have the spirit, I don't think. I think that's another thing. It had more of an old school spirit to it, which is not necessarily what people were going for in the 70s. Part of the reason New Hollywood worked out so well was because the 70s was, for whatever reason, in lots of ways, culturally, a time when people were embracing new to ridiculous lengths, to the point that counterculture was really becoming alive. Again, it's funny how things work in shifts sometimes, because we've got, say, the 50s, which is sort of America's big coming out party after becoming sort of a superpower after World War II, and the baby boom generation and the rise of the middle class and all this stuff, and the baby boomers being the first real generation that were ever catered to when they were teenagers. That had never happened really before in the history of anywhere, where suddenly the people that were making like film or art of any kind or saw teenagers as a demographic consumers to target. They were the first. So anyway, but then the 50s had, of course, it's the values that it's known for, being very white bread and conservative and all this stuff, and a clamp down on the different, to the point where you clamp down so much that you have the explosion of the counterculture in the late 60s going into the 70s. But then it all has to clamp down again, because what happened in the US basically at the start of the 80s was a return to the old values. This is basically how Ronald Reagan got elected. He was saying, it's kind of like what Trump says now about making America great again. He basically said the exact same thing. Like, it's time to make America great again. What he meant was sort of the days of the 50s when this and this and that was going on and everything was family oriented, blah, blah, blah. So that was the other thing I think that was helping sort of the shift in these movies too, was 77, okay, sure, it's still going, but some things are not going so well either. So the next few years, you're seeing a public that is very much swayed by a return to old stuff. It's funny, even a little thing like Happy Days is a good example, where you and the Partridge Family and stuff like that. You saw stuff in the 70s that was, you had all this edgy out there stuff, but then you saw some of the other stuff creeping back that was doing a callback to the old style. And I think that's another thing that led to this collapse, whereas movies were new and edgy, and that was great, but it gets to a point of oversaturation where people want maybe to go back again and they're feeling nostalgic for older things. So this movie sort of caught in between that, because it's right before that starts to happen. It's still caught in the sense where people really still want new and edgy, because I think the movie has a very pulp, old school film that feels completely outdated and outclassed by something like Star Wars. It's like it's some sort of old truck like the movie is, where Star Wars is this gleaming spaceship right beside it, you know. What else? What do you think movies are going to, what do you think the people are going to go for? So I think that's an interesting point that random critic said that I have no idea who it was from. I just read it on Wikipedia a second ago about the cultural shift and the demographic shift. I think that's true.
Sure. Yeah. This, when I think of Friedkin, he's not like, even in the top 10 of directors I think of when you say New Hollywood. It's almost like he was like one of the old school guys who kind of was just making movies during that period of time. Because even movies like To Live and Die in L.A., it feels like an older movie to me. Even though it was made in the '80s, it feels older than that to me.
Sure.
So yeah, I could totally see that because Star Wars is it's made for young people, right?
Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the power of some of these movies. The power of some of these movies towards the end of the New Hollywood movement is that they were so powerful in that they almost, through their success rather than failure, helped hasten the end too, because they were outpacing the movies that they were with. Jaws and Star Wars would set trends that would be in place for decades to come. So they actually led to a point where it's almost like too much too fast type thing, where this gradual movement is working, but suddenly it can't be sustained. It's like it got ahead of itself. And so suddenly there's this big void or sort of hole for a movie like this that's kind of unremarkable to just completely fall into.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've got One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and All the President's Men, Star Wars, and all these things. And some of those films haven't really even been equaled yet, at least in some people's opinions, as far as overall impact and what they could have. As you said, I think this is true. You said like New Hollywood's probably your favorite era, and it's easy to understand why, because it almost created it just burned so brightly.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a way of putting it. Like I said, it was so successful that it couldn't possibly be sustained, and it almost set like an impossible standard for itself to maintain. And it's really interesting because it's not like good movies weren't made in the wake of it. It's just that they had to change so much, I think, which is a good thing. But it's really fascinating to look at from a historical perspective. But in the case of a movie like this, it doesn't really have any place in that, it seems, at least not in any obvious way. It does in some subtle ways, we said. So it's very easy to understand why it would get overlooked or forgotten. And when we look at it now, there's all sorts of things that we can say that are good about it, but I feel like I'm more hung up on the negative things, even though neither of us believes this is a bad film. It's interesting. But it's a symptom of the time. Again, all these other great successes and hits and these things and these paradigm shifts and all this other lofty bullshit you want to say. And then you just have this movie it's trying to do a few things. Okay, that's ambitious. And it succeeds at some of them and it fails at some of them. And in this climate, that's not enough.
Right.
You need resounding success. You need something that absolutely revolutionizes everything. And this is a film that couldn't possibly live up to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of underwhelming in the scope, of what was going on. So yeah, it's like a movie I could see like my dad watching like on a Sunday afternoon or something. Sure. It's not like the epitome of movies coming out around this time. Star Wars and
right.
Even though he directed The French Connection, I don't really I know it was a very successful movie, but it doesn't really feel like a new Hollywood movie to me. In that it's I don't know. It's just it seems like it's mostly like old tropes in there. Mm-hmm. With the exception of maybe the car driving scenes. It's basically
yeah, sure. I pretty much agree with that too. It's not a movie that I would really include as a big pillar of the time. It just seemed more like it was a good movie that came out at that time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it wasn't a good movie. It was doing the same things that some of these other good movies were going. Like, I don't feel like you said, it's one of the ones that's definitive from the time. It just happened to be a good movie that was made at that time. I don't think it carried forward the way some of these other movies would. And that's fine. Not every movie has to do that. But yeah, I'm the same way. It's not one that I would cite when I'm talking about New Hollywood and the movies that were happening then and how they were changing things. I don't think that is one of those movies that really was bringing out a bunch of changes or anything like that. The main change it did was, for whatever, was that it I guess made Gene Hackman a star.
Right.
But
I mean, with the exception of the the techniques they use to film the car driving scenes, I mean, it's pretty much, there's nothing new happening there, nothing innovative. Unlike a lot of other films during the same period of time, like we talked about, Network and stuff, really controversial.
Sure, yeah.
Controversial topics, and I don't know.
That's another thing this film is sort of lacking. I mean, it is true that they're all anti-heroes, which is a big trope that was introduced in New Hollywood and really took off in the 70s. But the fact is, there were just way better anti-heroes in that decade. These guys, they don't compare, so it's easy to forget. It does have some cinematic storytelling techniques that are interesting now because they are sort of a snapshot, because they're, even though this movie isn't probably a direct cause of it, but is part of it, it's some of the stuff that would be completely abandoned by the studio system going forward. Being as simple as like the location shooting, where we'd gone from an era where we didn't shoot on location because we couldn't, then we didn't shoot on location because who cares, it's the movies, to, hey, let's be authentic and let's shoot on location, to, okay, this is getting expensive and problematic. Let's see how well we can fake it.
Yeah. Oh, man. So, I think we pretty much talked this one to death.
Yeah, more than I thought we could. I mean, not that it doesn't necessarily deserve it, but as usual, I feel confident and content that, again, even though it's a movie that neither of us are particularly in favor of, or really feel, it'll probably be a long time before I revisit it, or that it's still a movie I feel like I can recommend to people. As usual, I think it's worth a watch, and honestly, I'm not as laid back about that as a lot of people who are just like, well, it's worth a watch, because no, I am more discerning as far as that goes. I don't like when movies waste my time. So I think I can tell anybody watching here, even if they're spoilers, that there's definitely worthwhile things about the movie, and it's interesting, just some of the stuff we talked about, some of the stuff they tried and how some of it worked and some of it didn't, and I don't know, it's still an admirable attempt, I think, and even if it's not ever going to be remembered as a great film or anything like that, it is proof that William Friedkin is a good filmmaker through and through, because even if this is considered a miss, it's in no way a bad film. It just was more like it was lacking than it was bad. That's more how I put it. It was lacking. There were things it was missing. There were things it should have had that it didn't have necessarily, because I don't feel like, oh, the acting was so bad or the story was so bad. Like, no, that was more or less on point. I mean, none of it was mind-blowing either. Some of the stuff is fairly impressive in how they shot it, and yeah, I still think it's a movie I could recommend to people, particularly if you're interested again in New Hollywood. Like we said, it's interesting because it's not really one of those earth-shattering examples, but it served our purposes in that we wanted to talk about one of the movies that helped precipitate the end. This is a good example of that too, where it's not even necessarily a big disaster, but it's showing enough things sort of not working or going wrong that we start to see that gradual movement towards the end of the era and studios clamping down again, and films marching on and changing. So another good snapshot of its time, with some stuff that's you can just really tie down to the era. And if you're a fan of somebody like Roy Scheider, it's an interesting little film too, because I don't think it's definitely not one of his roles that most people talk about or think about.
Yeah.
And I don't think we were too hard on him, because I don't think it's like he was terrible or anything, but it is kind of interesting to see him thrust into a role that he's not really, maybe not even through any fault of his own, that he's not really suited for, and just sort of giving it his best shot.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I'm, not not being fair, but I don't know. I felt like he was overacting a little bit at some points, especially when he was, they would come to another, roadblock in their journey, and he would flip out, and he'd go rage in the woods for a little bit, and then
See, that was one of the things that I felt wasn't well enough explained, and that we didn't get enough of these characters. Like, I didn't understand why he was more emotional than the rest of them. They didn't give us anything to explain why he would, react this way and they wouldn't. I wasn't getting enough explanation or anything to clarify the differences between these guys. The other guys seem basically pretty stoic about it, and he's the one flipping out. And I don't really get it. They are all in it together. The stakes are high for all of them. And I mean, it's true. Yeah, some people are more emotional than other people, except this is the first time we've ever seen it. So I think it's just sort of annoying because I don't know. We don't get into it enough. Yeah, my main problem with this movie is it has all this promise with a really great prologue, setting us up with these characters, and then it doesn't deliver. In that once it gets them together, I don't think they do enough or say enough.
Sure, yeah, I'd agree with that. It's it lacks the character development for you to really care about these guys as anti-heroes.
Yeah, I think character development is the main thing it's lacking. It's lacking quite a few things, and the soundtrack is odd too. It doesn't help. This is a soundtrack that could have used some of the more old school. That's the other weird thing. As we said, that this movie has like the old school pulp thing, and yet the one big new Hollywood thing it really has going for it is like this sort of new agey, never before heard technique soundtrack that just seems bizarre, particularly at the ending. It seems like a really odd project for Tangerine Dream to do, although you have to imagine at that time they just would have been happy to do anything. So you're just thinking William Friedkin, whoever it is that gets final say in this, why'd he be like, yes, that's what's right for this old school pulpy movie with trucks that look like they're from World War II and guys in the jungle and, I don't know.
Apparently he's just like reaching at all of his, cronies, what they're doing in the industry, I bet Scorsese would use this in his film. I don't know. Since that's the whole reason he went down there to begin with, was because he wanted to do something like Coppola.
Yeah, that's possible.
It's the next big thing is going to be synth.
He's sort of right. I mean, kind of, but doesn't mean it fits everywhere. Although, I don't know. Sometimes, we see some of those 80 movies that have like the heavy synth, and we're just used to it because that's what it was back then. But when you think of some of them, like the context is like ridiculous. Like you're watching like some like ninja movie, like that Canon did, and there's like all this synth and stuff, and you're like, what is that? But I don't know. Should have gotten Rick Wakeman to do it, the guy from Yes.
Oh gosh,
some badass keyboards.
Well, they wanted one of the guys from Hall & Oates to do it, so to star in it. So they could have got Hall & Oates to score it.
Star in it, man. That probably would have made this movie an absolute bomb.
Warren, is that his name? Warren Oates.
Yeah, that sounds right. Man, yeah, I can't imagine that guy acting.
I think that's who they wanted, but when the budget got blown up so much, they had to get a bigger name like Roy Scheider.
Okay. Well, I guess it proves that even though Roy Scheider probably wasn't the best guy for the role, he wasn't the worst either. Because, man, that would have been bad.
Talking about scores, though, keep in mind that Wang Chung scored the entire film of To Live and Die in L.A. So,
I'm just starting to think that William Friedkin either he doesn't care about music at all, or he cares way too much.
Yeah, I think he cares too much.
I think he's in that area, and neither is good, because if you care too much, it still backfires.
I'm not going to lie, I do like a lot of the tracks from Wang Chung on that soundtrack, but it's a little bit much. It's a little much.
Because, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much credit you can give Spielberg for working with John Williams, but one thing he knew about working with John Williams was to stay out of his way. And just sort of trust him. And I mean, I can understand how that'd be hard to do. I'm not a filmmaker, but if I was, I'm a person that really cares about music, so I could see me like really like getting in the face of the composer and probably annoying the hell out of him.
Well,
You know,
yeah,
me
I mean,
saying, you know, I really want this scene to blah 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 blah.
yeah.
And, you know, I probably would do that.
But I mean, you hear about it all the time, where some famous composer scores a movie, and then the director just hates it, and they get
Yeah.
somebody else to score it again in like 2 weeks' time.
That happened to like Michael Kamen like 6 times or something.
Oh man,
Like directors like fought with him and stuff. And he seems like such a nice guy. Well, he's dead now, but Michael Kamen.
yeah, you can
He
imagine.
did so many great scores. It's hard to believe, you know.
I mean, it's got to be a hard thing to do without seeing the finished film or even any of the film at all, and to create an entire score based off of that. I don't know.
Sure.
It's got to be a difficult, you have to have a good vision of what the director's trying to do, I guess. Because, I mean, all right, we're going to see the Brachiosaurus come up. I need you to hit me with that score.
Another thing that's interesting is that this is the only like major movie, not counting his made-for-TV movies, that Willem Friedkin was also a producer on.
Mm-hmm. He probably was forced to throw some money into the pile.
Yeah, it probably got to that point, right?
I would imagine so.
They're splitting it between 2 studios. All these problems are happening. They're in a foreign country. They're just like, okay, somebody else open your wallet. And he's like, fine, I'll do it. Just have to get it made.
Yeah, among everything else that we mentioned, a hurricane wiped out one of the sets. So,
One of the things I take away from this movie that's kind of annoying, well, there must be something I can find out about, is it really makes me want to read up on the movie that didn't get made, that he thought he was going to do, the Triangle thing movie. What was it? The Devil's Triangle. Like, I thought there'd be an article on that, but there isn't. I'll find something somewhere, because that's what he was going to do. It was going to be his next major film. It was going to be some sort of, if not sequel, some sort of like spiritual successor to The Exorcist. And then like it fell apart completely, and then so he put it all of it on this movie.
Have you seen Exorcist 2?
Oh yeah, it's one of the worst movies of all time.
It's probably the worst sequel ever.
I mean, well, yeah, if you take into account how quality of how good the original is, and weigh it against the sequel, it probably blows it away. Because I mean, sure, you can say some slasher or whatever is some really terrible, but then when you weigh it against the original, it's like, well, the original's good, but it's not like The Exorcist, right? So I think that's probably true. The quality is
it's probably the most disappointed I've ever been, because I was such a fan of the original film. I was like, oh wow, they made a sequel.
Exorcist 2 is bad in many ways, but the way that goes right for me is that it's baffling. Things in it are so weird and incomprehensible and stupid. It's hard to imagine that people came up with it.
It's like a drinking game where every time they say Pazuzu.
Oh my god. It's like they're going out of their way to I don't know, tell you the original was a fluke or something. That's what I mean. The second one is so bad, it's fascinating to me because it's bad in that way. I mean, you can make a flat bad movie. This isn't a flat bad movie. This is a weird batshit, incomprehensibly bad movie where you don't even understand how they could have achieved it. Because you can totally understand how you could make an underwhelming, boring, disappointing Exorcist sequel. Sure. But it's not those things. It's off the wall terrible.
Well, this is the same year, 77. So by comparison, $14 million budget. Opening weekend, it made 6.7. So let's see, worldwide. I don't see worldwide here, but just in the U.S. it made 30, and rentals it made 13. So that's a success.
See, I'm not getting enough stuff on the Devil's Triangle here. I don't understand. Friedkin originally conceived Sorcerer as a little $2.5 million in-between movie, a stepping stone to realize his next major project, The Devil's Triangle, the planned follow-up to The Exorcist. However, Spielberg at that point had already made Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which presumably nullified the project. Why? Why would that nullify the project?
Yeah. I said the same thing.
Was it going to have aliens? Were aliens going to come down and say, we are the devil, we possess you? I don't know. I'm gonna have to try to
Man,
find some stuff on the Devil's Triangle.
There's nothing on Wikipedia.
I've always been fascinated by movies that don't get made anyway. But,
yeah. The best. Okay.
But I guess we're good to wrap. But finally, we've gotten our shit together a little bit, and then we can tell you, assuming everything goes okay, that we'll be back next week and we will finish off New Hollywood in style with a noted disaster of the era to really cap it off. Although another movie that's been reassessed over the years and a lot of people found good things to say about, and a movie I've been fascinated with for years without having seen, and that's Heaven's Gate. Which is usually the #1 movie that people come up with when they talk about New Hollywood, like ending.
Problems with it.
Yeah. So I know sometimes we don't want to go for the obvious on this show, but we thought it would be okay with this one because it's still the obvious within sort of a specific parameter, blah, blah, blah. I think there's a lot of people that are aware of Heaven's Gate but haven't necessarily seen it. And again, I think it's going to be a fascinating movie to see within historical context and stuff. And even people that haven't seen it, I'm sure like there's just legendary stories about like what was going on in the set and the director going mad with power and stuff. It's definitely probably the most prevalent and emphatic example you can come up with of a sort of taking all the New Hollywood stuff and how it could be abused or done the wrong way. Although a lot of people have said there were some things that were sort of unfair about how the movie was judged, and there's still a lot of good to take away from, and that's what we'll get into, of course, when we do it next week. I'm pretty confident I'll be able to find a version of it. I wish I could. I honestly would just like buy it if I could, but
well, if you're interested, it's called Final Cut: The Making of Heaven's Gate is on YouTube, and
I will definitely have to watch that.
Great documentary.
Yeah, because I want to have a lot of good. Although, yes, people, you can watch that, but you still need to watch us because you need our specific opinions.
Exactly.
Because that's what makes this show amazing. All right, so thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for your patience if anybody's been watching live tonight, because we know we kind of made a mess of things the last couple of weeks. I think that happens, though. People slip with the summer, the dog days of the summer. It's one of the reasons why the Sausage Factory takes the time off and stuff. But we'll fight through that and get it back together. And we don't know what we're going to do yet. Probably not necessarily a series right off, maybe just a few standalone movies, but that will mark the end of New Hollywood, although that doesn't slam the door on everything from that era or, you know, us being able to say some stuff about New Hollywood going on, but it will finish the series that we did that stretched a little longer because of some of the time off and stuff. So after Heaven's Gate, move on into something completely different, and we'll let you know. So thanks a lot, guys. I think that's going to do it, right?
Yep. Tune in next week, guys. We'll be talking about Heaven's Gate, and be sure to watch it and to prepare for the show. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks a lot. Pocket Dimension. I'm Cole. That's Jay. See you guys.
Thanks.